All right, today we're going to dive into the story of a massive global religious movement. And what's really fascinating is that it all started with a founder who was, well, surprisingly frail and unassuming.
You've probably seen them. Groups of men, often in simple clothes, maybe carrying their own bedding, traveling from one town to the next. They're part of what's known as the Tabligh Movement, a movement that has just quietly spread all across the globe. So the big question is, where did this huge grassroots effort even begin?
Well, the answer, really, it all starts with one man, an absolutely extraordinary figure named Melania Elias. And look, to understand the movement, you have to understand him first. And just listen to how people who worked with him described him. They said he was, quote, a mere skeleton, but one who can work wonders. I mean, what a striking image, right? It just perfectly captures the whole paradox at the heart of this story.
So here's that paradox in a nutshell. Physically, Maulana Elias was, well, he was slight, short, and so frail that he sometimes even had a speech impediment. But, and this is a huge but, that physical weakness housed an absolute will of iron. We're talking about an indomitable spirit, a purpose so strong that people who are way more physically imposing just couldn't match it.
Okay, so you have this man with this incredible spirit. Where does he decide to focus all that energy? Well, his mission began in one specific place, tackling a very specific challenge, the spiritual state of his own people in a region called Muwat.
So what's Mewat? It's basically a region just south of Delhi, and it's home to the Mio people. Now, at the time, they were a semi-tribal community. They had actually converted to Islam centuries before, but in practice, they'd held on to a lot of their old customs.
And this was the core of the problem that Maulana Ilyas saw. The Mayos were, as the source puts it, Muslim in name only. I mean, get this. They still had Hindu names like Nahar Singh. They were worshipping idols, celebrating Hindu festivals. They even did things like leaving a lock of hair on a shaven head, which is a common Hindu practice. Formal prayer was so unfamiliar that if they actually saw someone praying, a crowd would gather around to watch, thinking the person was either crazy or sick. That's how far things were. And look, this wasn't just an internal observation. Even a British officer at the time, a guy named Major Pilot, he wrote in a report that the Mio people were, quote, half Hindus in their habits and customs. So this was the deep-rooted cultural inertia that Maulana Ilyas was determined to change.
So when you're faced with that kind of deep-rooted inertia, you know a conventional approach just isn't going to cut it. This next part of the story is all about his search for a method that could actually spark real, lasting change.
His first attempt was, pretty logical and conventional. He thought, okay, I'll set up a network of religious schools, or madrasas, all over the region to educate the kids. And he really poured his energy into it, even offering to pay for all the students' expenses himself. But then came this moment of crisis. One day, he bumps into a young man who had just graduated from one of his own schools. And he was absolutely shocked. The young man was clean-shaven, with zero outward signs of the Islamic identity he was supposed to have learned. And right there, in that moment, Maulana Ilyas realized his whole approach, it had failed. The schools were teaching information, sure, but they weren't actually changing the people. So why not? He thought about this really deeply, and he came to a pretty radical conclusion. The problem wasn't the schools. It was the environment. Think about it. Students would learn one thing in the classroom, but then the super powerful influence of their everyday culture would just wash it all away. He realized the only solution was to separate them from that environment completely. So his new formula was simple, but honestly, it was revolutionary. Instead of trying to change people inside their normal worldly atmosphere, he decided to take them out of it. He started organizing groups of people to leave their villages, to travel, and to stay in mosques, to be totally immersed in a religious environment. This was the breakthrough. All right, so this new method needed a simple, focused curriculum, something that anyone, whether they could read or not, could understand and act on. And that's what led to the movement's core principles. He basically boiled the entire program down to these 6 points. It starts with the absolute basics, right? Understanding the creed, establishing prayer, gaining knowledge. But then it includes these really practical elements that make the whole thing work. Respecting other Muslims, the super important act of sparing time to actually travel for the mission, and always working to purify your intentions. It was simple, it was actionable, and most importantly, it was replicable.
And that emphasis on prayer, on trusting in divine help, that became absolutely central. In fact, there's a story from the city of Moradabad that just perfectly shows how this worked in the real world. So picture this. A team of 3 men get sent to a local mosque to preach. For 2 nights straight, they get up and give a speech after the evening prayer. And for 2 nights straight, the second they finish talking, every single person in the mosque gets up and walks out. They were being completely ignored. As you can imagine, the men felt like total failures. But then, they remembered a key piece of advice from Maulana Ilyas. He'd always said, when you face a wall, when you're struggling, leave the people, find a lonely spot, and turn to God. So, the next day, that's exactly what they did. The 3 of them went outside the city and just spent the entire day in prayer. That evening, they came back and gave the exact same speech a 3rd time. But this time, the result was night and day. The source material says, they all seemed rooted to the spot. Not a single soul stood up to leave. For them, this was all the proof they needed. The work wasn't just about their own efforts, it was powered by sincere prayer. So this combination of a really simple message and a pretty radical method, it had a dramatic effect. First, it completely transformed the region of Mewat, and then, well, it started to spread way beyond. I mean, the transformation in Mewat was just profound. You had a region that was once known for things like looting and robbery, and it became a place where mosques and schools were being built in literally every settlement. Those old customs were abandoned, drinking stopped, and prayer became widespread. The entire society changed from the ground up. Now, Maulana Ilyas passed away in 1944, but his mission didn't die with him. Not at all. His son, Maulana Muhammad Yusuf, he took up the cause and basically dedicated his entire life to expanding the movement. He's the one who turned it from a regional revival into a national and then global phenomenon. And the momentum was just incredible. Think about this timeline. The work starts humbly in these little villages in Mewat in the 1920s. By 1941, their first major gathering pulls in 25,000 people. Wow. After the founder's death in 44, his son takes it across the entire Indian subcontinent. And then, just 2 decades later, by the 1960s, it's gone truly global. You've got groups traveling to Europe, to Japan, to the USA. And that brings us right back to where we started. The story of the Tabligh movement is, in so many ways, the story of its founder. And it just leaves us with this one fascinating question to think about. How can the unshakable conviction of one single physically frail person spark a quiet, grassroots movement that eventually crosses almost every single border on Earth?